see. Yeah, right down there. Okay, that's perfect. And you are using the link, correct, Erin?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perfect. All right, now here we go. I knew there would be tech issues. I don't think I've ever done a Zoom presentation without one. So again, I'm here to talk about fentanyl, something that we've all heard about. Maybe some of us have been personally impacted. I know I have. And just being in the industry for as long as I have been, I've seen some really interesting and pretty scary trends. So I'm going to just do a high level overview of fentanyl, a little bit about the history, talk about some of the aspects that make it so potent, and then go into what it means for those of us who are service providers, and particularly in the state of Washington right now. So Erin, if you want to just go ahead and go to that next screen, it's a little bit of an introduction about me. My name is Sarah Spear. I put my personal mission statement up here. I'm a heroin survivor on a mission to help end the opioid crisis. And I want to stress the word help, because obviously I know that I, of myself, am not going to end the opioid crisis, but I believe in the vision of big thinking, and I believe in having a big mission because it's something to strive for. I also know that other countries have actually ended the opioid crisis that they face. So I believe in the hope that that is an option for the United States at some point, hopefully within our lifetimes. This is very personal for me. I was a heroin addict. I'm coming up on 14 years of recovery, and it was a hard fought battle. Prior to my addiction, I actually worked in film. I worked for the Coen brothers and Josh Brolin's production company. I ran an international nonprofit in Africa. It was very high functioning. And then I found heroin through the introduction of a boyfriend at the time. And what I can tell you is I know what it's like to have your brain be hijacked. From the moment that I was introduced to shooting heroin, I became a ghost of the self that I once was. And I spent nearly a year and a half, spending every single day looking for another place to put a needle into my neck. And so it got that bad. I ended up having hepatitis C, superior autonomic artery, an artery disorder, and then I contracted gallbladder. And I share that hopefully not as a trigger, but to really paint the picture of the depths of hell that this experience took me. I'm alive today only because I had a mother who was my care navigator and was really my champion in this really broken behavioral health system. And if I hadn't had my mom, who was just going off instinct to try and help me in that broken system, I have no doubt in my mind that I wouldn't be here right now with you today. So she piecemealed a program of different sober livings, different treatment centers, and I was able to get help for about a year. But again, as we know, most people don't have that privilege, and I'm very grateful that I did. Once I got sober, I decided that I should probably do something with the second chance that I was given. So that's when I enrolled in school, and I studied international political science with a focus on socioeconomic development. I really started to focus on the international opioid drug treatment system. I wanted to really use my personal experience and look at that on a more macro level. And that's when I really became interested in policy and seeing what the rest of the world had done. I then went into behavioral health, into the system, which I always said I was going to change. And then I very much became a part of, as most of us sometimes happen. And what I can tell you is, I think we all know that the behavioral health, particularly the inpatient facility treatment programs, is a very fragmented and broken system. I was aware as an individual going through it, and even more as a professional trying to navigate that landscape. I did work on some projects that I'm very proud of. I set up about 7 different sober living houses. I worked for Daybreak, which was the largest adolescent Medicaid treatment provider. And my role was external relations, but also innovative program design. And so that's where I had the opportunity to implement the Restorative Receiving Center for commercially and sexually exploited youth, the first program of its kind. I was the Medicaid transformation manager. So really working on integrating physical health and behavioral health into our care. And that's when I first really started working with maintenance assisted treatment programs, which we'll go over a little bit about. Daybreak was one of the first early adopters to give youth option to choices on what their recovery needed to look like. I also have started a number of opioid task forces, including the one in Spokane. and I'm a founding board member of the Safe Fentanyl Initiative that's worked with the DEA Operation Engage for the past couple years. So I've had a lot of work in the realm of opioids, as Jim said, both personally, academic, and professionally. And I'm now the founder and the director of something called Follow the Poppy, which is an all-encompassing opioid support resource that I've just recently launched. And I think it goes really well with the work that Jim's doing and kind of the pursuit to make a better system. And now here I am with NorthStar Advocates, which Jim just did the best introduction ever. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the more formal aspect of our training. Erin, if you can go to that next slide. Okay, so a lot of words on here, but what I wanted to do was we hear a lot about fentanyl. I wanted to just do a brief history and timeline so you can see the evolution of fentanyl, because it's actually been around since the 1960s. A Belgian chemist actually designed fentanyl with the idea to create the most potent and powerful pain management tool, and he did that. Unbeknownst to him, I'm sure he had no idea what it would turn into. By the 70s, that's when we started to see different patches, lozenges, different formations of fentanyl that were being used. And by the 90s, it's more of a trend of just general opioids. You started to see physicians and pharmaceutical companies use fentanyl for purposes other than the most severe patients, which really was cancer, end-of-life patient pain management. It started to transfer into more of the post-surgical pain, breakthrough pain, some of the more and less acute pain. And that was, again, a trend that started to happen, unfortunately, with the opioid crisis. By the early 2000s, you started to hear early reports of fentanyl being abused by patients. There was not a lot of attention paid to it, but it kind of was just more of a subtle undertone, but they started to see just how potent and addictive this formulation really was and had the potential to be. By the 2010s, it really started to be more misused, and it started to be mixed into heroin. And that's when we started to see a lot more of the heroin overdoses. A lot of the geopolitical landscape at this time began to influence fentanyl as the modern day player that it is now. You know, in the early 2010s, 2012s, 13, 14s, it was a heroin epidemic. But what you have to understand is that was driven by poppy fields and the production of opium in Afghanistan. As that landscape started to change, the global kind of drug field began to adapt. And so China really became one of the main central players with labs and learned that they could manufacture fentanyl, which was more potent than heroin, for a much reduced price, and they would get a lot more of the substance. And so then you really started to see the cartel begin to team up with China on this mass distribution. It was easier than trying to navigate the political landscape of the Afghanistan and Middle East during that time, and think it's so much cheaper to be able to make this synthetic compound rather than worry about the crops if the poppies, survive that season, what's happening with the Taliban. So it just was a lot easier and cheaper. And that's really what was the main driver of the world use of fentanyl and the distribution. By today, now it's the main driver of all opioid and drug overdose deaths. I'm about to play a slide on this next slideshow. And what I want you to do is pay attention to the red line. It's probably about a 30-second video. And I'm just prepping you because once we go on there, it's going to start to play. But this next slide really shows the breakdown of all drug overdose deaths in the United States since around the early 2000s. So you can see the rise of the drug epidemic and the opioid crisis. We want to pay attention to the red line because that's going to be the number of fentanyl to really paint a picture of just how big of an issue this is today in our country. Erin, I'm going to have you go to the next slide and make sure that the volume on your computer is on or on the video. It's like down maybe at the bottom right. It's a little volume icon.
Oh, yeah. I'm worried about the sound because it is on my second screen.
If the sound doesn't play, that's okay. There's just a nice music that makes it feel a little bit more dramatic. But the content ultimately
It
is
played on my end, but I'm guessing you didn't hear it. So, um,
and I'll tell you all about it when I see you again.
it almost worked the sound. But again, we're going to be looking at the red line.
Both go what your way, and the vibe is feeling stronger. Was small, turn to a friendship, and friendship to a bond, and the bond will never be broken, and love will never get lost. Never be crossed. The stop is pretty over with that vibe. I should be on, and that line is what we should so remember me when I'm gone. When I'm gone. When I'm gone.
All right, Aaron, I appreciate the attempt for the volume, but really, this is what I was just talking about, and this is a visual representation of where we are. And this was actually 2 years ago. So the numbers, I believe the latest data was actually around 75,000 of the opioid deaths were fentanyl, particularly fentanyl. But the latest numbers of all drug overdose deaths for the United States is over 111,000 people in 1 year. 1 year. And the driver is fentanyl. So I wanted to play that video because I think we hear about fentanyl. Jim, go ahead.
So when it says overdose, does that mean there were actual deaths as well, or overdose?
Oh, yeah. All right. So this is all deaths over the years, and it's each year. So fentanyl, you can see in 2021 killed over 65,000 people. But the overall death in 2021, I think that statistic, I think it was 108,000. Don't make me do math publicly, but it was high in 2021. And so this is a representation of all the deaths over the years. And just, you can see that trend, but this is just how potent and how prevalent fentanyl has become. We really, not to sound dramatic, because I think I've maybe worked with the DEA a little bit too much at this point, but this is the worst drug crisis ever recorded in the United States. And fentanyl is one of the most horrendous and scary substances out there. We're seeing similar trends in Washington State. So I took a clip here. Everything that I have that's not mine is linked if you do want this slideshow. So this is linked to the Department of Health's opioid dashboard. And what we're seeing here in Washington is from 2019 to 2021, we saw that opioid deaths doubled. And the primary driver of that is, again, fentanyl. So we're seeing similar trends right here in our state. And it's just pretty shocking. Aaron, do you want to go to the next slide, please? Okay, so I just wanted to quickly talk about why, and I think we've discussed that, but three of the main reasons that make fentanyl such a powerful force is first, the potency. So it's 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. Again, going back to 1960s, the Belgian chemist set out to make the most powerful opioid known to man, and he did that. If you look at this picture that I have right here, you can see how little fentanyl it takes to overdose versus heroin. One of the interesting, and I don't say interesting in a good way, but one of the, fascinating or interesting things that set fentanyl apart is what it actually does to the electrical activity in a person's brain. So right here, I'll link that because it should be linked, but a hospital that's affiliated with Harvard found that the drug actually stops people's breathing before any other noticeable changes and before they even lose consciousness. So it's that quick. It also interacts with your dopamine on such a stronger level that your brain is just completely hijacked. So it really is chemically so much stronger than anything that we've seen today. And that third part is, again, I can't keep stressing this enough, but it's the manufacturing. It's the geopolitical, socioeconomic push that this drug has really changed the landscape and the global drug use and production. It's cheap, it's easy, it's small. And what they're doing is they are mixing fentanyl with a majority of other drugs. So that's one of the really key things to understand. And I'll talk about this more in a real life setting, but you do not have to be addicted or abusing fentanyl to be impacted by this. And again, it's because of this manufacturing, the Chinese labs, and then also people are manufacturing it just like they were meth. You have these labs that are here, they're local, they're in the United States. So you have, professional labs, and then you have really unprofessional labs where there really becomes more issues, but they're mixing it with every other drug. It makes it more addictive, it's cheap, and so that's really what's causing a lot of the overdose deaths that we're seeing. Aaron, do you want to go to the next slide? Okay, so real world observations in a treatment setting. As I said, my previous experience has really predominantly been in inpatients, but at Daybreak, I was responsible for collecting quite a bit of the data. And I was always talking with admissions and outreach and clinical team, and we needed to do reports for the Medicaid transformation. And so I started to see some horrible trends, and I talked to the youth a lot. That's one of the things that I think is so important, is to actually talk to the youth that we're serving, because they will tell you what's really going on and they know more than most of us. But what I saw by the numbers was there was a 60% increase, and this was youth 12 to 18 that were abusing fentanyl as their primary drug of choice. Now, this is shocking because before this, I think the number, it was roughly 28 to 30% were opioid users. The vast majority was primarily actually alcohol and cannabis, with some methamphetamine and opioids back in about 2018. And then you just started to see this shift of primarily fentanyl. Nearly every single youth, 90% of the youth that entered the receiving center for commercially sexually exploited youth, which is predominantly tied to unaccompanied and homeless youth, 90% of those youth were addicted to fentanyl, heavily abusing fentanyl. And there was a strong correlation that we started to see with the trafficker that was using fentanyl, as well as the youth who were abusing fentanyl. So there was a real strong dynamic there that really caught my interest, that I was starting to kind of look into more. Higher recidivism rates across the board. You just almost knew if somebody was heavily addicted to fentanyl, they didn't have treatment long enough. You have the insurance verifications go through. If that youth is going out, that, unfortunately, they're going to die or they're going to come back. And I don't want to be dramatic, but it's like the amount of parents that our clinical team had to call when they passed away. And it's not just in that setting. I've worked with treatment facilities all over the country. I have friends that run them, for better or worse, and this is just across the board. And then the opioid withdrawals. This is one of the things with fentanyl, and there's so many other things we could talk about, but fentanyl causes more severe withdrawals, and it's a lot harder to actually taper people and withdraw people from fentanyl. And that was very apparent within the youth who were in withdrawals from fentanyl. It was a lot harder to manage, and the acuity went up, and it was a whole different ball game than if somebody had been on heroin or maybe prescription medication. Aaron, do you want to go ahead and go to that next? And here, this is my personal opinion, but the most dangerous time in a person's opioid recovery is the day they leave an inpatient facility. I believe this wholeheartedly. I linked a genetic study from a Utah university, but it's because of the tolerance effect that opioids cause. And so the worst thing that you can do is get off opioids when you've built up a high tolerance, go into a setting that's very structured, and then be discharged without a safe and secure environment. And the moment you leave that inpatient facility and you're faced with that trigger and your brain goes into fight or flight and you're going for that drug, if you take any high of amount, you're dead. And oftentimes, again, what you have to realize is this, it's not rational. When the trigger is hitting and after you've been in treatment, really, like even just substance use disorder, it's the neurobiological aspect of it. You often don't stop and think, probably shouldn't do too much, just you get triggered and you end up taking the same amount that you took before you went in, and you're dead. And I've had more parents call me. I've known people who have died. It's a travesty, and we have to do better. And that's really why I was so passionate about the work that Jim was starting with the bridge and this team. Even before I became a part of it, I just know how needed it is. Because again, it's like when you do make that courageous decision to go in and to get help and to deal with your trauma and to go through that long of a treatment, you deserve a safe and stable place to exit to. Because the worst thing you can do is then we set kids up and youth up to die. I mean, really, I don't want to be dramatic, but that's what we're facing. And it's not everybody, but again, it's really, really key in the world of fentanyl that we're dealing with right now is to take this super serious, which leads me to my next slide. So what does this mean for us? And if you're a service provider, your awareness, your understanding, your support can save lives. But the first thing I put on there is, if you are a treatment provider or a service provider, you're discharging, returning youth to community. I love that language more, but it has to be a robust discharge and return to community plan with screening that identifies somebody as a fentanyl user. It's key. And if you're a provider on the other end of that, who's maybe receiving youth, it has to be a quick follow-up. Time is of the essence with this population. And so if you maybe, if you are a provider and you have an ARMP who's prescribed medication management of Suboxone, you better make sure that that next ARMP is lined up and ready to make sure that that youth has their medication in place and ready to go. Because a lag in prescription or a lag in care and that soft, warm handoff that we all talk about, but often doesn't happen, could not be more important when we're talking about youth and young adults who are abusing fentanyl. Number 2, everybody should know the signs of opioid use. One of the most telltale signs is pinpoint pupils. I can't stress this one enough. I also have to say there are medical conditions that may cause this. I'm not a doctor, but there is a lot of different medications, medical disorders that can cause this. But if you know somebody's maybe been abusing drugs, look at their eyes, especially if it's light out. If it's really tiny and it's a pinpoint prick, that's a really clear indication that somebody's abusing opioids. Drowsiness, you'll call this nodding out. If you see somebody who looks like they're falling asleep, that's another really, large sign. Behavioral changes. People often think that opioid users tend to just be more quiet. That's not always the truth. Extreme anger and agitation can also be a sign, as well as many other things, but just abnormal behavior that's not normal. Euphoria and slurred speech. Those are some of the main signs to really look out for, but those pinpoint eyes and the nodding out is a really clear indication. Number 3, can we please give people the respect to have individual treatment plans and control over what their recovery looks like? There's a lot of debates within the recovery world of harm reduction versus abstinence. And quite frankly, again, this is my personal opinion, I believe in empowering that individual to figure out what's going to work best for them. So there are lots of different options. There's medication-assisted treatment. If you're over 18, that includes methadone, that includes Suboxone, which is also the off-label name is buprenorphine. There's Subutex. They've just developed a new injection, and there's naloxone. So there's Vivitrol injections, which is an opioid blocker. There's peer support groups. There's 12 steps. There's unlimited. There's AA, there's NA, there's Heroin Anonymous, there's Fentanyl Anonymous, there's Pills Anonymous. There's also Refuge Recovery, which is a Buddhist base. There's medication management that's actually for Suboxone users who are in recovery. And there's Smart Recovery. So there's a lot of different peer support groups that people have choices. Mental health, let's make sure we're addressing co-occurring. That's key. I think all of us here, especially Jim, I know you know this, but the mental health aspect is really important when it comes to substance use disorder, as well as medication management. So individual treatment plans and just giving people the dignity. And if they try something, maybe something else is going to work. I just see too many people get stuck in the debate of harm reduction versus abstinence. And I just want to start to kind of break that stereotype and say we deserve dignity to find out what works for each of us as individuals. The last part is naloxone. If you're a service provider or if you're working with this population, I hope you all have naloxone. I'm sure the healthcare authority can help you if you don't, not to put that on them, but naloxone is absolutely key. I've included a really great video that really talks about what naloxone is. So if that's something that you're interested in, I can make sure I get that for you. But this is key because it will save someone's life. And something I want to point out is it only works for opioids. You cannot harm somebody by giving them naloxone. But there's also some prescription guidelines that are starting to change when it comes to fentanyl. And I'm happy to bring on an expert pharmacist to talk about this, but they're finding that you actually need to maybe double the dose now because fentanyl is so strong, and there are other formulations like carfentanil and other even more potent fentanyl strains. So a lot to learn there, but please have naloxone on site. And again, if that's a training that you'd like, I'd be happy to set something up. But in the meantime, I put a great YouTube video. I won't play it, but it's there if you need it. And really the last thing is I have it over here, but we're facing a drug crisis never before seen, as I said, and I believe it's time to wake up, get creative, invest in new solutions, and work together. And really that's why I joined the Bridge and NorthStar Advocates team. And I'm excited to work on this project and to work with all of you on this call as we try and build a better system and really make sure that you don't die and don't become homeless when they leave behavioral health settings. So with that, Erin, my next slide is questions. Does anybody have any?
Yeah, let me just say, Sarah, that was fabulous. I think most of us who've been in, whether we've been in this work for a lot of time or recently, we know when we're in the presence of expertise. So I want to thank you. I'm going to make a couple comments here and then open it up to questions, and we'll take all your questions. I just want to say a couple things that you said, and we talked about this. I'm so respectful of those who share their lived experience. First time I saw someone shoot heroin, honestly, I was 5 years old. It was the older kids in the neighborhood. And when I came into this work, I could not talk about that in the way today we honor lived experience. And I think that is really, really powerful to normalize it, because when I came into it, I wouldn't have got a job because addiction and my experience with heroin, et cetera, that would have been viewed as a character flaw, no matter how many letters you had behind your name. And now I think and it's sad to say, but it's true, that the fact that this epidemic has hit middle-class families has sort of opened it up, that it's not just those people. It's something happening in American culture. I also want to thank you for raising the issue of co-occurring disorder. Again, when I started in this work, we talked about dual diagnosis and co-occurring, and now it seems to be sort of SUD or mental health psychiatric. And I've never met anybody who didn't have an addiction who didn't have some other mental health issue around depression, anxiety, and somewhat to the reverse, that somebody who has got a mental health issue, particularly if they've been surviving on the streets, one of the ways they survive is drugs and alcohol and other drugs. The third thing I'll say, and then I'll open it up, is how powerful it is and why we came up with return to community versus discharge planning. Particularly young people who have been homeless, have been in foster care, they have been placed in X number of different homes, never having a single say in which home they family with. So there is a genuine and kind of instinctive, I think, opposition to when anybody's making a plan for me that I'm not involved in creating. And I think any of us would have that response, but especially if you have life experience as a 15-year-old with 10 foster homes. So I think we do have to find ways to allow any person to be involved in their own life planning. Where will you live and what would it take to get there? What relationships are important to you? So anyway, I just want to emphasize those. And Bridget, please.
And just a quick comment, Jim, I also remember the co-occurring all the time. And I also remember when you couldn't get mental health treatment unless you were drug-free for 30 days. Do you remember those days too? Yeah, that wasn't all that long ago. But Sarah, great job. Really appreciate it. I certainly can, I learned a lot. I have a question in particular, though. At the very end, you were talking about doubling the dose for Narcan. Is that
Don't quote me on that.
okay?
But that's why I said I'll bring on a pharmacist. But what they are seeing, and this is from DEA and the pharmacists that I've worked with, that they're needing stronger doses of naloxone.
Well, and the other thing that we've run into is that we will throw out our Narcan when it has an expiration date. And then just recently, what I heard, I think it might have been from the Spokane Regional Health District, but again, don't quote me on that either.
Yep.
Ignore.
Just a reminder, we're recording all of you. So we're not quoting you. We got you on record.
Richard and I are dosage.
But what they said is ignore the expiration date.
Yeah.
Because we would throw out, sometimes we throw out like 5 or 6 doses because they were expired.
Yeah.
And now they were saying, ignore the expiration date. I don't know if you've heard anything about that.
I have, and that's why I think one of the trainings I'd like to bring on is an expert naloxone pharmacist trainer who is up to date on all of the norms, specifically with fentanyl, as well as other opioids. But that way it's not me giving medical advice, but I've heard that, and I'll make sure that that's one of the trainings I bring to this group.
And if there's a way to be able to share that with our direct care staff too, so they, sometimes I'm not as very good at taking what I'm learning here and bringing it down to that level for the direct care. I would love if there's a training available for that.
It's a good thing you said that, because part of looping back to Jim and our discussion with the website is we want to host our trainings online. So, and in a way that's easy to get, so that if somebody misses it or we need to share it out and it's important, we have a place where they live.
Very cool. Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll also say we have other experts on this call. So one of the other things, when Sarah and I get a chance to do some planning, I think a good panel with folks who are doing the same work all day from around the state. So we want to engage you. MJ, comment, question, please.
Yeah, so when you were showing the graph of the fentanyl like skyrocketed with respect to death rates, I noticed that there was also antidepressant deaths that had steadily increased, and then it also shown that like heroin has gone down in respect to deaths related to such use. So I was just kind of curious, like how like fentanyl skyrocketed, but yet heroin's gone down, and fentanyl is usually like in heroin and in methamphetamine.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I'm not an expert to speak on the drug overdose trends as a whole, but what I can say as an assumption is a lot of the people who are abusing heroin have now gone to the stronger component, which is fentanyl. And it's not always mixed. And so that's something that needs to be clear as well. There are still some drugs like heroin and methamphetamine that are pure heroin and methamphetamine. You just will get batches that are mixed with fentanyl. And I also know this would be another interesting training, how overdoses are actually identified and marked on the death certificate. There's a lot that goes into that. And so I would love to have an expert, and if somebody here is one of those, but to talk about that as well, when it's maybe a fentanyl and a heroin versus just a fentanyl, what it's actually classified as. But I think the overall trend is that more people are abusing fentanyl, and it's more lethal, which is why it's causing more of an uptick in the deaths over the years.
Yeah, and the other thing that surprised me was like people overdosing on antidepressants. I hadn't heard of that per se. So usually that's supposed to make you feel better, I would think.
I think,
Too
Jim,
much of anything at the
yeah,
wrong, especially at the wrong time.
yeah, and then you have
And
alcohol.
I saw that too. It didn't seem like it was exorbitantly a large number, but that it does happen. Yeah. All
Yeah.
psychiatric meds have some risk for sure.
And especially if you're mixing it with alcohol or other substances as well, then there's some, again, I don't know how they would classify that on the death certificate though.
Okay. Thank you for
And this is a good opportunity to remind everyone that MJ is also with NorthStar Advocates in the Bridge as a fairly new team member. And so again, want to welcome you and thank you for your involvement, participation. Any other questions or comments before we move to the next piece of the agenda?
I just wanted to comment that I think that I've seen a lot more of the fentanyl versus like heroin or something, and the young people are just saying because it's so cheap. It's a lot cheaper to get just fentanyl than heroin now. And so that drives it too. They can get sometimes blues or something like that for 35 cents, which is mostly fentanyl now.
It's such a good point. Yeah, and that's part of that mass manufacturing, but it's so true.
Denise, can you
And-
remind us where you're from, please?
I'm with Cocoon House.
Yep, thank you. I just want folks to know.
Yeah. And it is also, it's harder to detect, like you can't smell it like you could meth or something. That lingering kind of cat urine smell with a lot of different drugs doesn't come into play when they are using just more of the straight fentanyl. And so it's a lot easier for it to go undetected.
Wow. Again, information you get from someone on the front lines.
Really?
Many of you may know Cocoon House is an outstanding organization in Everett. They have emergency shelter and housing and serving youth and young adults facing unaccompanied homelessness for decades. So thank you, Denise, for being here.
Thank
V.
you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about the data, like who collected the data and like the demographic and the population?
For the video, it was,
Yeah, the video.
it was based off the CDC that somebody
Okay.
put together that video. That I did not do. I just thought it was so impactful, especially with the music, but
Yeah.
Yeah. I was just wondering like who would report those numbers?
that's a good question. It's however
Hospitals, police departments,
the health,
anybody getting CDC money?
yeah.
Imagine people would abuse antidepressants just because like they aren't, how do I say this? They don't have access to other drugs. And I think people that abuse this is just from like secondhand experience. Like I've heard a lot of stories about this. It's just that's all they have, and they aren't, I won't get into this that much, but there's a lot of I'm not surprised about it. That's why I would say. Yeah. Because I did heard from like nurses that worked in hospitals when you're prescribed antidepressants or like mood stabilizers or anything like that, you get like a 30-day dose generally. So it's harder to overdose on that. So that's why people would mix it with like alcohol and everything. But like I said, this is not I'm not generalizing this. This is like experiences I've heard out there. So that could be a reason.
Well, in my own practice, I'm very careful. I'm not a prescriber as a master's level clinician, but have contracts with psychs and AARNs, Ps. So if it's not working, then they will continue to use alcohol and other drugs. Yes, if someone's got a suicidal ideation or history, then they might get a smaller amount, 30 days, sometimes a week at a time dosage, so that we can check on them. So sometimes it's intentional, and again, trigger alert. Sometimes it's an intentional suicide attempt. Sometimes it's sort of accidental because they are mixing it with other alcohol and other drugs. And so just that the interaction biologically is causes problems. Yeah. Any other last comment or question?
Yeah, I'm just gonna jump in real quick, Jim. And appreciate the presentation. My name is Johnny Ota. I work for Ryther. I have traditionally worked in 2 drop-in centers, the University District Youth Center, the Orion Center. Currently have a clinic at the Orion Center with a prescriber on my team, Dr. Taryn Hansen, coworker Abby Woods. And definitely just all day, every day, deep in this epidemic. And also, like, all of the things that you all are doing and planning on doing is extremely important to us, both for adolescents, which we all know is a huge issue, and then also any type of shelter housing program after getting out of treatment. And so, I've been working on all this stuff for quite a while, but I'm gonna need to join in with you all. And we have a lot of people that we are working with right now that are currently actively using fentanyl and or in recovery from fentanyl use, and also in the juvenile justice system. We're working with them quite a bit. So really appreciate it. It's definitely a topic that I am a participant in on a daily basis. And so I want to thank you for that.
Thanks so
Oh,
much.
Johnny, thank you for the decades. Johnny and I go way back, and he's been on the front lines for decades also. You probably know, Johnny, we have had some good meetings with your executive director and staff at Ryther. So we've been talking to them and invite you in any of those meetings. Would love you to be part of this. But that's a great segue. And again, it's also an opportunity to say thank you again to all of you who are on the front lines, whether you're providing legal advocacy, outreach, housing, whatever it is. It really, to beat up an old proverb, it really does take a village. I will also say one of my favorites is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And that's really what this coalition's about. Again, thank you for the segue. We'll move into the next piece around the bridge residential, which it goes to Johnny's point. It goes to what we all know, which is the Bridge Coalition, which we're doing here right now, has got, and I think is starting to make an impact. I really hold myself and those around me to a high standard. So while I'm glad we're meeting monthly and when some of the cool signs are starting to happen, like we're getting calls from young people and from providers, we're